Boom. I wanted to try something a little bit different today. We're going to be talking about enlightenment and the path to get there. So I'm going to start with a little story about the first time I did ayahuasca, which is like 18 years ago now, when nobody knew what this vine was. I decided it was a smart idea to hitchhike to Central America and pursue the shamans who were continually communicating with the spirits and the plant medicines that surrounded them. So out of this brave adventure, I ended up with a fairly well-known ayahuasca shaman from Peru. And I was quite cocky at the time. I roll up to the shaman and she's like, hey, in Spanish, she's like, hey, so, you know, what kind of trip would you like? And I'm like, oh, you could hit me as hard as humanly possible. By this time I had done so many psychedelics that I was like, just send me as far off into outer space as humanly possible, basically. And I drank about 2.5 cups, and within maybe 15 minutes, it felt like I was following these dragons through these wormholes. And there was a moment, probably a long moment, maybe like 4 or 5 hours, where I was in a state of what I consider egolessness. So I'm going to try to explain that. I'm going to use a few stories. This is a little bit longer, it's a bit of a more abstract video, but seeing as I just want to start by trying to communicate more of my feelings with each of you as we go through this next step, that's what I'm going to do. So there I was, laying on the jungle floor during an ayahuasca ceremony, and there were people to my left throwing up, people to my right crying, some people laughing, dancing, puking, pooping, all of the bodily sounds of release. And I distinctly and viscerally remember not being able to tell the difference between these sounds. They all sounded the same to me. Whether it was puking or laughing, it could be an orgasm for all I knew. It sounded like it was the same thing. And this became increasingly important to me, I think, to reflect on understanding, is that our perspective of each of these sounds of release is largely built off ego. It's our own understanding of our relationship through the changes of this life and nature. And here I'd like to make a book recommendation called Siddartha by Herman Hesse. It's only a few hundred pages. It's a very short read. You can read it in a weekend if you are an avid reader. And it goes through a fictional story of Gautama Buddha's life from when he was a young boy. Growing up, he became interested in spiritual practices, and he started to revolt against his father and his family because they were not spiritual enough, basically. So he left his family and started to wander around and do all these practices like deep meditation and fasting and waiting and putting himself through just meditating straight in the rain, like not care, it doesn't matter what nature is doing, I am sitting here proud and stable. And he realized at one point, it's like, I'm not getting it. Like, where am I supposed to? He's like, I've meditated for so long, I've fasted for so long, I need more. Maybe I need a teacher. So he started to travel around and follow some of the other spiritual gurus. And during that process, he realized to himself that it was not the teachings that the gurus shared, but the way the gurus each individually lived their lives. So he thought to himself, well, the only way I'm going to ever be able to figure this out then is just to go about my natural life and not try to follow someone else's particular path to enlightenment. So that's what he does. He ditches his friends, he ditches his gurus, and he goes and he starts meditating by a river one day. And he's seduced by this beautiful woman who crosses the river. And out of like almost confusion, he follows this woman into a city. And at this point, he doesn't have any skills. He's like, I can meditate and fast and like wait. I'm really good at that. He's like, so what can I do in a city? So he ends up becoming a businessman, a very good businessman at that. Makes himself a bunch of money, seduces now the woman that had walked by him at the river. They have a child together. The child starts to grow up. And at one point, the wife passes away. She dies accidentally. I think it's from a snake bite in the book. It's worth reading just to double check. And he starts to get angry at the world. He starts to drink. He starts to gamble. His son disowns him, and his son ends up leaving him similarly to a way that he had kind of left his father in the past, showing this echo of what we do as children to our family is likely what our children are going to do to us. So it's good to just try to repair our family situation as soon as possible. So there he is, his wife's passed away, his son's disowned him, he's a drunk and a gambler, and he ends up drunkenly stumbling back to the river where he started. And he meets the ferryman, like the guy who's operating the boat back and forth across this river. And he starts to sit with him and practice. And he realizes that this ferryman is actually the most enlightened person he has ever met throughout all of these journeys to visit gurus, to sit, to practice. Nobody else was as enlightened as this ferryman. So he's like, I'm going to stay here and I'm going to learn what you know. And the ferryman teaches with him this idea of the river, that the river is his teacher. It's not a guru, it's nature itself. It's like the water itself moving becomes the teacher. And at one point, the ferryman dies, and he takes over his job as the ferryman. So now it's his job every day to basically ferry everybody back and forth between each side of the river. And he's meditating by the river one day, and his son comes his son ends up taking the river, but his son doesn't recognize him. His son ends up taking the ferry. He doesn't recognize him. And as he's sitting by the river, he starts to recognize that enlightenment is not all the meditation or all the fasting or all the practices that he had done up to that point. It's not that he was a drunk or a gambler or a husband and like a disowned father. He started to hear the river as all one sound. And that moment when I heard like puking and shitting and throwing up and laughing and crying, and it lost all meaning and just sounded like consciousness, this is what he heard. He heard that all of the flavors of the life that he had lived were leading him to the enlightenment that he was now sitting at, which is that all of these aspects of the river, all of the sounds of pleasure and pain, our consciousness singing in basically eternal enlightenment. Anyways, just a thought I wanted to share. As I was talking about yesterday, climbing up this high mountain peak and having to come all the way down to the bottom of the mountain and then looking back up to the mountain, recognizing I'm a better mountaineer now, one of my friends pointed out to me that it might not be just the journey up Everest that's interesting. It may be the entire pilgrimage through the Himalayas that are the part that's deserving. And there is no better peak or valley than the other. They're all the same. And they're all offering you your path to whatever enlightenment is at the end of the day. And then at the end, Buddha or Siddartha dies. He passes away by the side of the river, enthralled in its song. Anyways, dear with the Arcane Bear. Enjoy your river, ladies and gentlemen.